So I just want to put a little note at the start of the episode that the audio quality may be a little bit down in today's show. I recorded this episode with Will Porter on Skype, and as we recorded, I guess some of my audio cut out. I didn't find out till after. I went through the episode, I re-recorded that audio that was cut, and so you'll definitely be able to hear the difference when it switches back from the Skype recorded audio to the audio I recorded after. But everything in the episode should make sense. The audio will just sound a little bit different, and I hope I captured everything that was potentially cut by Skype in our conversation, and here is the episode.
You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focused podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 519 of the Foreign Policy Focused podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Will is a staff writer at RT. Frequently, he's the Monday guest on the show, although we got it mixed up a little bit this week. So he's on Friday. Stuff to talk about. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. How you doing, man?
I'm doing all right. And it's crazy times going on, of course, and I was just watching some videos, and as we record this, I think there's some protesters trying to burn down a police precinct somewhere in Seattle. But we'll keep it a little bit, I guess, more civil and talk about the U.S. foreign policy today, where other than a ship in the San Diego port, I don't think anything is burning right now. So not all, I guess, terrible stuff to talk about today, but we certainly got a lot of important stuff and some big news. So one of the places that we want to start is just talking about some of the big spending that's been going on, particularly as Congress is getting ready to debate this next stimulus or bailout bill, whatever they're going to call it. Of course, the government is still requiring millions of Americans to be out of work, just making it impossible for people to keep in their businesses. And so, there's a lot of, demand, grassroots demand for some kind of bailout or stimulus for the American people. Unfortunately, I'm guessing we're going to get more of what we saw with the CARES Act, where, maybe we do get some pennies and they give us a little bit to get by. But for the general part, the massive part of the bailout goes to the people who are wealthy and connected and who are just going to continue to rake in billions of dollars. It looks like to get Congress to give $10 billion to weapons makers. It seems like these are going to like the bigger weapons makers too. The Pentagon has already and Congress have already bailed out smaller weapons maker companies, and then different companies like Boeing have been able to cash in on like the airline bailouts, even though, a lot of what they do now goes to military spending. So we really have a crazy thing going on here where there's so many just average Americans is going to set to give $10 billion to weapons makers. I mean, well, me and you are kind of regular guys, I guess. And I don't know about you, but that, just a tiny, like, 100th of a percent of that $10 billion would be unbelievably life-changing to somebody like me or you, to I think most average American families. I'm guessing that, that small amount of money to the U.S. government would, be something for a lot, would be just absolutely so important and life-saving. And yet Congress is just going to write it off to weapons makers. And of course, they're going to get some of it back in campaign donations. But generally, it's not, the solution that we want. Now, I guess somebody in the Air Force has a solution for that, and that is to nationalize the weapons industry. I don't know exactly how this would work in the U.S. My guess is that, the weapons makers and the people who sits on the boards and stuff have enough money to actually keep this from happening in like a full sense. But at the same time, I'm thinking that, hey, maybe they'll start to like buy up some of the stocks of these companies and stuff like that, if the Pentagon's not already doing that, and look to exert more control that way. and probably end up with just more kickbacks. The Air Force general is like on the board as the Air Force member before, and then he retires and goes and sits like as the board member of Lockheed or Raytheon or whatever after he's retired and made some more money. I don't know. What do you think here? Is Congress going to give away more of our money to the weapons makers? And then is there any solution at all here in nationalizing anything?
Yeah, I mean, I could easily see this happening. I mean, this is just like, part and parcel of how the U.S. military or weapons like procurement system works. I mean, we know that like politicians can be bought for like pennies on the dollar, where corporations have to spend very little lobbying and they get massive kickbacks in public funds and resources and stuff. And so this is all just very par for the course on the way that our weapons procurement system works. And an interesting little piece of that story about the $10 billion they're asking for now is that it's interesting. Congress actually authorized the payments without appropriating funds. So like how typical, just blowing money they don't even have, giving away money that they don't have. Now they have to scramble to find some way to hand that out, and I'm sure they'll find a way. They typically do for these arms contractors. And when it comes to like nationalizing, it's kind of an interesting question. Like as libertarians, typically we are, completely against nationalizing any industry. Like, it's better to have market forces at work and supply and demand and stuff. However, with just how corrupt and just incestuous the arms dealers are with the government, I almost wonder if it would, be an improvement in some areas, and just in terms of like the kind of contracts they're giving to these companies, the sweetheart deals. Like I'm completely not convinced that it would, fix any of these questions, any of these problems. But I do kind of wonder, like, maybe it would address some of that. I know that like Russia's like weapons system, for example, like the way they procure and produce weapons, as far as I understand, it's gamed a lot less, and there's a lot less like insane amounts of just like handing away tens of billions of taxpayer dollars. But so I don't know, like, nationalizing might have some effect, but I would not really call for that as a solution, I guess.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But I think the examples you would point to, like Russia or China, who spend like multitudes less on their military, and if you look at the products that they come up with, I mean, I'm not like, the Russian fighter jet is some kind of, miracle or something, but hell, the F-35 is a piece of junk. He spent $1 trillion on that, so how much worse can it get? And who knows, maybe the best case scenario is that they do nationalize it and absolutely tank all these companies somehow, make them even more competent and inefficient. And that seems like it can only be a good thing, but maybe not, because right now we have a pretty incompetent military, and yet they get away with spending just about as much money as they want. Another aspect of these bailouts, Will, is just how much of the money has been a just upward transfer of wealth. We're seeing this laid out pretty well in an article from the Intercept. I'll link to it in the show notes page, and it goes through how the banks are set to make about $18 million in fees processing these small business loans. For libertarians right now, one of the things that I think Peter Schiff did really well on his recent appearance on Joe Rogan was talking about how the banks are just processing these loans and they're guaranteed. Nobody's even looking into them. JP Morgan Chase is apparently going to make $1 billion processing these loans to banks because the government's backing them up. And so it's just a huge giveaway of our money to these massive institutions who are already, have the richest people on their boards and as their owners, who are only going to continue to cash in and make more money this way. So it's really disturbing. And then the last thing I'm noticing is that a lot of the loans only went to businesses with, already connection to large banks like JP Morgan Chase. And so I sometimes go to like the main street close to where I live, and there's a couple places there that seem to have been there forever, not really struggled at all, for over the regular course of time as a restaurant or something. If they don't, haven't taken out a loan before or something, I mean, it can maybe be terrifying for them right now. They're unable to get a loan. I think a lot of cities have seen this. I know I see it in Boston, where there's, restaurants and bars and stuff that have been open for decades and decades and decades, who are all closed for good during, the COVID and the shutdown and everything. And you have to wonder, had they had the, same access to funds and treatment as these large U.S. corporations, that they would be struggling as much, while you see these companies, a lot of the board members are so shameless, they're paying themselves $1 million bonuses, even while they continue to collect this money. The other thing I'll just mention, there was a great write-up in the 10th Amendment Center by our friend Mike Meharry on budget deficit, which was short of $1 trillion, but not by that much. Being if it was a year, it would be the sixth highest defense or the national deficit for an entire year, and it was a single month in June. So, Will, I'll let you weigh in on the rest of that however you want, but just I know a lot of Americans have paid taxes this past week, as the official filing date was now July 15th this year.
Right, man. Yeah, tell me about the paying the taxes. This year was my first time I had to pay as like an independent contractor, so I actually had to like send money to the government. It was horrible, like without withholding and everything. It was a terrible experience. I'm not happy to keep repeating that. But yeah, with these stimulus packages, it's just been crazy. It's been an insane bonanza for corporations and banks, and as you said, the politically well-connected. That's really who this is about. It's not necessarily I don't think the wealthy necessarily as a class. But certainly the politically well-connected have been completely hooked up in these stimulus packages, and it's just like I think actually some of them have been like the largest spending Congress has ever passed before. These coronavirus packages, like relief bills or stimulus or bailouts, whatever you want to call them. But anytime you have this thing where the government is handing out insane amounts of public resources, billions and trillions of dollars worth of them, you of course are going to have all kinds of like vultures and leeches surrounding that, looking to game that system in however they can. And the federal government is so clueless and incompetent. They don't have they couldn't possibly keep track of all these transactions and figure out, I don't know, they couldn't possibly do their diligence on all of these. And so just, the scope and scale of the fraud and abuse going on right now, I don't think we know, but I think we can assume there's a massive amount of that going on, a massive amount of gaming the system to get this money. There's a lot of companies signing up for some of this relief that don't need it or don't qualify, but they're getting it anyway. So there's been all kinds of stuff like that. And yeah, this is just the latest in that, ongoing scandal, I guess.
Well, something else that I really do think should be a scandal here, Will, and I talked about it for the first time on Wednesday's show, and I have a whole lot more information on now, and that is at least 3 branches of the U.S. armed forces, the Navy, Air Force, and Army, are all monitoring or running Twitch accounts with esports teams playing Call of Duty to recruit kids into the Army, Air Force, and Navy. Like, we only recruit kids 16 and up, but they allow kids as young as 12 on this board. There's an article here from The Nation that I'll link to in the show notes page. They detail how people who have come on the forums and said, negative things about the U.S. Army, like telling these kids, hey, Call of Duty is Call of Duty, where, you're only running around killing the enemy. But in reality, the U.S. Army does things like the My Lai massacre, the Kunduz hospital bombing. And so those people have been kicked off or removed from the chain. It seems like there's some people who have been kicked off or removed for asking tough but legitimate questions. And so, they're looking for easy picking. I think the part of this that just disturbs me so much is seeing how kind of Twitch works, where these kids are able to sit there and chat and with these Army guys or whoever for hours and hours at a time. Apparently, especially in the Army, they're talking about how, oh yeah, I'm in the Army to play video games, and that's my job, and that could be your job too. And boy, well, doesn't that sound good? They don't go that, you got to be like a E4, I think, or something like that. So you got to have been in there for a while and probably need some connections to get on this esports team. Is, not just like any enlistee gets a chance to go and sign up for the Call of Duty team. The channel is also including free giveaways. And so, again, it seems like kind of just an unfair recruiting practice on kids. And people have started to try to chase some of the recruiting out of the high school. I guess the only reason that could possibly be bad is now, look, they're innovating and they're coming up with a way, I think, to get into the minds and into the lives of kids in an even more nefarious way than doing it through the high school. And I was telling Will before the show, showing up to the locker room and hanging out with the football team and stuff like that. This seems to be a way that they're maybe really going to be able to at young age, 12, 13, 14 years old, and basically have them on the hook all the way until they graduate high school. Well, I don't know if you have anything to say about that or how familiar. I haven't really used Twitch before, other than like to monitor protests. I haven't done it to interact with any, e-gamers or anything like that, but I don't know if you have anything there.
Yeah, that's fun. I've also like Twitch. The only use it's had for me is monitoring and following the George Floyd protests. That's the only use I've had of it. I'm not really a gamer myself, but occasionally I dabble a little bit. But this is like a super insidious, sophisticated way of recruiting and propagandizing kids, I think, especially in the context of like war games like Call of Duty and stuff. Like you can just imagine the conversations they're having. Like, oh yeah, you want to actually go shoot one of these guns, for real, or ride in one of these airplanes or something. Like you could just see how a 12-year-old would be so influenced and impacted by that. And so, yeah, like we were talking off air about, recruiters coming to our high schools. And I recall seeing, kids doing push-ups and trying to impress the recruiter guys. And it is kind of disgusting. But I think this is on like a totally different level. Like this is really insidious. It's a sadistic kind of thing. I don't know. Trying to capture. What did you say? 12 years old? Was that the youngest?
Yeah, they said there's at least kids on the forum allowed to be there at the age of 12. Again, I don't know how Twitch works. I'm kind of surprised because I remember that when I, was in high school and played Call of Duty myself, I think I had to bring my dad to the store with me just to buy the game.
Right.
And so it seems kind of odd to me that, there would be allowed, but I guess, you click like the I'm old enough or, I'm okay with a little bit of blood and gore, and then they let you on and allow you to play. So, yeah, that's apparently what it said in this article, was that at least children as young as 12 are some way interacting with an Army, Navy, Air Force esports team through Twitch.
Yeah, I mean, just like at that age, like you can't possibly have a concept of like what joining the military entails and like what kind of risk. Even a high schooler, even like a 16 or 17-year-old is really not equipped to make that decision, I don't think. And of course, the recruiters never tell you what the risks are. Like, people obviously know that you can die in war, but like they don't talk about PTSD and people shooting themselves when they come home, and alcoholism and drug addiction and all the stuff that often comes with, being a combat veteran and stuff. And the military will never tell a 12-year-old. The 12-year-old probably can't even understand that, let alone like will be told about it. So yeah, that's a real problem, I think.
Right. Well, and I was just thinking about that too, with the added kind of psychological thing of, them playing video games. Like, how much more is it going to seem to these children who are actually watching people in army fatigues play video games, looking at, actual warfare, like a video game, and not understanding seriousness and casualties and, civilians being blown up and stuff like that. But I think we should move on because we got a lot of other meat of this episode to get through here, especially this Trump executive order that he signed on Hong Kong. Fortunately, Dave DeCamp showed to help me keep up with what's going on in the South China Sea and some other places around Hong Kong. But on the recent show, we didn't get to the Hong Kong issue and what's going on with Beijing and mainland China. So Will, fill me in. What's Trump's executive order about, and how will it affect the U.S. relationship with Hong Kong and China?
Yeah, so earlier this week, the Trump administration finally made good on something it's been threatening to do for a while, at least since last year, maybe longer, but definitely since 2019. And that's basically abolishing and getting rid of the special relationship and the trade arrangements the U.S. has had with Hong Kong for decades. And that was done on Tuesday after Trump signed both this executive order, and there was also sort of this like regular sort of companion bill pertaining to Hong Kong and China that he signed on the same day. And the actual law, the bill, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, that basically just reiterates and expands on previous threats of sanctions for Chinese entities that the U.S. has made before. That, they're claiming that these entities are involved in rights abuses in Hong Kong and undermining its sort of like semi-independent status from mainland China. And in this case, I think they were singling out banks and financial institutions. They had that in mind specifically. And so the bill is pretty straightforward. It just threatens new sanctions on Chinese banks. But I think this executive order, it's sort of a companion thing. I think it's a bit more significant and needs a little more like context and history to really understand what it does. And so both the bill and the executive order actually build off of previous legislation. And that all kind of started with the 1992 Hong Kong Policy Act. And that law kind of laid out some of the special rules for the U.S.-Hong Kong relationship, and it allowed the U.S. government to start treating Hong Kong differently from mainland China, especially when it came to things like trade. That's really the major thing here is trade. And that Policy Act, just to give a little more context, was passed in anticipation of the British handover of Hong Kong back to China in 97. And until that point, of course, Hong Kong was a British colony still. and had a totally different system from mainland China, from their communist system. Hong Kong was way more capitalist. They had a way friendlier business environment for foreign investors, things like that. But after the handover in 1997, Hong Kong became what's called a special administrative region of China, and they agreed to let it keep its like legislature and its market economy. And this is what's known as one country, two systems. That's like their policy toward Hong Kong. So there's supposed to be sort of a distinction. Hong Kong's supposed to be much more free market and sort of independent from the mainland. And, the U.S. relationship and all the special rules and stuff were established in that 92 law. And so with all that stuff in mind, just knowing that there is a unique arrangement between the U.S. and Hong Kong, last year, on the heels of these mass protests in Hong Kong over this proposed extradition law that, would have given China more authority over Hong Kongers. We've talked about that bill before, and we've talked about the protests and how U.S. Agencies linked to the U.S. government have bankrolled and backed that protest movement. The NED and the U.S. Agency for Global Media discussed that. But all along, the U.S. has used those protests in Hong Kong as a way to sort of take jabs at China, regularly accusing it of violating rights and eroding Hong Kong's autonomy and breaking the sort of like one country, two systems thing, things like that. And so in that same spirit of, taking jabs at China, last year during these protests, Congress passed a bill that amended that original 92 law, which they called the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. And so this law passed last year. This is the important part for the executive order, because that law basically tasked the State Department with doing a yearly review of Hong Kong's autonomy status, and they conditioned the special relationship on that review, meaning that if the State Department finds that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, it's going to revoke that special status and those special rules. And so back in May, that's exactly what Mike Pompeo did. He declared Hong Kong is no longer autonomous from China. And that is what paved the way for Tuesday's executive order, which finally made good on the threats and ended the special arrangements with the city. And so one of the major outcomes that's going to come of this is that tariffs on Chinese goods are now going to apply to Hong Kong's exports, U.S. tariffs, when they didn't previously because of those special rules. And theoretically, it could also have some effect on like visa restrictions and immigration and other things like that. But trade is really like the major issue here with this executive order. And so that is basically where things are with, that EO. The sanctions are always kind of a big deal, but like that's kind of routine nowadays. But taking away the special status, I think, is like a big deal. Like we're going to have to wait and see exactly how it's applied in practice. There may be exemptions. It may not be fully applied in force. Yeah. But I think this. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe. I just wanted to jump in and ask, what is the reception of this in Hong Kong, as far as you could tell? I know the protesters have been generally pro-U.S. and everything like that, and so I guess they've been kind of looking for American interference. But at the same time, what you just told me is that Hong Kong is going to lose their special status, which seems like it will, and so will likely be doing less business with the U.S. just because it's no longer a way around tariffs and stuff like that. Is I mean, I guess, you haven't traveled to Hong Kong, so if you don't know, you don't know. But it seems like maybe there would be some pushback here among just the Hong Kongers as well, but possibly not. Because, like I said, they seem pretty relentlessly pro-American, at least the people can make a big deal about it.
Right. Yeah, we have seen Hong Kong protesters waving around American flags and singing the American national anthem and asking for U.S. intervention and stuff. I'm not 100% sure, though, like what the specific response has been. I haven't really seen too much of like the reaction there. But it is kind of an odd thing. Like if this move is meant to sort of penalize and punish China and to help Hong Kong, you would think that rescinding its special trade status and imposing all this economic pain on Hong Kong, you think that wouldn't really be consistent. Like it sort of does take a jab at China because China does consider Hong Kong like part of its own country. And so they would take that as like an affront to them, too. But yeah, it is kind of an odd move here trying to hurt China by hurting Hong Kong. And another odd thing here, too, is that like all along, China's position has been that like Hong Kong is part of China. It's one country, two systems. And the U.S. is trying to wedge themselves in between that and trying to kind of split off Hong Kong and support these protests and separatist sentiments and stuff. But now we're sort of like taking China's position that like we no longer distinguish between the mainland and Hong Kong. So it's just kind of weird that we're sort of buying into their argument a little bit.
Right. Well, that brings up, I guess, the last thing I kind of wanted to ask you, which is just, Hong Kong is very, very close to mainland China. So, I guess Taiwan, you could somewhat realistically squeeze the Pacific Fleet in between the island and mainland China, but that's really not possible in Hong Kong. And so, what exactly is the goal? We It seems like the U.S. really couldn't do anything to protect or to help Hong Kong sovereignty should China just decide that it's not going to exist anymore. And in fact, it seems like these, moves by the U.S., like kind of the soft power stuff, the sanctions, is, and maybe without the U.S. involvement, mainland China and Beijing does the same thing that they're doing now. At least in part, some of Beijing's moves regarding Hong Kong over the past year and a half have been a result of the U.S. increasingly kind of using this, what they call soft power, national endowment for democracy type of funding and propaganda actions to, have a major uprising and protest movement there. So I don't know. Do you have anything on that? Like, what is the U.S. end game here and what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. Like, I think some of this is confusing. Like I was saying, like, hurting China by hurting Hong Kong just seems kind of odd. But honestly, in terms of like, stopping a Chinese invasion of Hong Kong, which I don't think is super imminent or likely, the Chinese did do some military exercises in like Shenzhen, which is pretty close there to Hong Kong in southern China, and that had all these hysterical predictions of invasion or something, which never happened. But honestly, I think the U.S. would like if China invaded Hong Kong. That would be a great thing to a great bludgeon to wield against them. I think some of the more cynical people in our sort of foreign policy establishment would be perfectly happy to see that. Just like they like to see when the Iranians gun down protesters and stuff. Like, it's a great thing to harp on, And so I'm not sure if their goal really is to stop a Chinese incursion into Hong Kong. I think they would actually kind of like that.
Right. And the disturbing thing is people of both parties, Joe Biden has big criticism of Trump on China so far has been he's not aggressive enough against the CCP. So don't expect it to get better if we elect Joe Biden in November. We had a major news story over Trump's secret order to give the CIA more power to launch cyber attacks. And so, I'm very interested in the order itself, like what Trump apparently gave the CIA the power to do. And then maybe we could get into if that he gave them new power for attacks, where he attacked and what he did, or what the CIA did. So, Will, tell us about how Trump empowered the CIA.
Yeah, sure. So Yahoo News actually had they had the exclusive on this week that I think is worth getting into here. And according to this report, back in 2018, Trump had authorized the CIA to start launching cyber attacks on a handful of different countries, basically without any White House approval at all. And while this happened back in 2018, I think this was like a ongoing thing. I don't think this was just for that year or anything. I think this was like permanently adjusting their authorities. And this was apparently done through what's called a presidential finding, which is like a specific type of directive that's related to the CIA and authorizing its covert operations overseas. And this finding also gave the CIA greater freedom to pick their targets and the kind of attacks that they can launch. When previously they were required to kind of consult with the National Security Council and get the president to sign off on these plans directly. Now they just sort of have broader leeway to launch these things on their own wherewithal. And usually these presidential findings, they're usually like specific and kind of focus on like a particular policy outcome or a particular goal. But this one was just broad. It was just like it just freed the way for more cyber attacks in general, at least according to the way Yahoo characterizes it. And of course, the countries that are singled out in this authorization are all the usual suspects. It's Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, which according to Yahoo, they say that each of those are singled out in this finding, in this directive. But they say it also could apply to other countries as well. So it's like, I think, kind of like vague on purpose to some degree. But another interesting thing here about this order, this finding, is that it's explicitly not for operations related to intelligence gathering. But it's specifically all about these real deal cyber attacks, about like disrupting or disabling infrastructure. So like targeting power plants, or also things like stealing and leaking harmful or embarrassing information. So those things aren't really about like intelligence gathering. That's more like a offensive hostile operation against another country, like destroying infrastructure or leaking embarrassing stuff. And according to Yahoo, the CIA has apparently carried out at least a dozen major cyber attacks since this finding was signed. And they don't get into like a ton of specifics and detail about those attacks, but they do say that there were some on Iran and some on Russia. And they do say that a lot of these were the sort of hack and dump style operation where they're, stealing information and leaking it. So, there are a lot of interesting details. Some of this stuff is a little bit left a little vague. Like I should say, like the sourcing on this story is a little bit questionable. Like it's all like, it's anonymous former officials with quote direct knowledge on the matter. And typically that's kind of a red flag for me. We've talked about that issue a lot in the past, just like that kind of anonymous sourcing and when it's kind of, the pitfalls of that. So I do reserve a little bit of skepticism that, that these are just like jaded former officials with a grudge against Trump. That's not very rare nowadays. It happens all the time. But on the other hand, I don't find the story implausible or unlikely at all. Like, it's very consistent with other policies of Trump's, sort of loosening rules of engagement elsewhere for the military. And he's taken a very hostile stance to all, toward all four of these countries that are reportedly named in this directive, and all of which we've launched cyber attacks against before many times, Iran and especially. And another thing about this story too, the Yahoo story, is it's like, I don't know, some of the stuff it leaves kind of broad, but if you like compare the Yahoo write-up to like the New York Times Russian bounties crap, like you can really see like the Yahoo piece gets into a lot more detail and has a lot more like weaselly hedging language. So I don't know, like I would encourage people to read this report and make up their minds about, how trustworthy they find it. I would like to actually see the document itself, which they don't have. They don't actually have the doc, or even parts of it I would like to see. But for now, I'm sort of like, treating this as plausible. I'm not totally on board, but I do think like I don't have any real reason to doubt it, I guess.
Yeah, it seemed a little bit to me more like an official leak, especially since within the past week, I also saw Trump announce that in 2018, the U.S. carried out a cyber attack on the Russian Internet Research Agency, which, we've talked a lot about on this show and is related to the whole Russiagate saga. And so when I, had heard that and then saw this story, kind of I went, Trump is trying to let it leak that he carried out cyber attacks against these countries in order to seem more hawkish now that, the election is getting into full swing. And it seems like Joe Biden will be running to Trump's right. Using that loose definition of right means more hawkish on foreign policy. That seems to be the Joe Biden game plan. And, as we're seeing his foreign policy team form, which has been covered by a lot of people over the past couple weeks, it is not good. It's the worst people from the Obama administration all thrown together there under a mushy brain Joe Biden. I'm sure Michelle Flournoy will run, the Biden administration somewhat like Cheney ran the Bush one. And it could be very, very, very dangerous, to have, not to use Trump's phrase too much, but a sleepy president in charge of, the world's most massive army and war machine, willing to churn through and destroy and wreck so many countries. One of those countries, not to divert too much, and something maybe we should talk about in an upcoming show, Will, is Libya, where you now have Egypt's General al-Sisi, our dictator there, al-Sisi, threatening to invade Libya and getting, support from most forces in eastern Libya because they now need to get some extra outside support to fight back against the other government support from Turkey. And so it's we're 8 years past that war. It's a failed state, and the ongoing civil war looks to get even bloodier. And this is, something that this blood is on the hands of Obama and Hillary. And I guess Biden advocated, against it. But he, had Obama's vice president resigned on him because of this war, maybe he could have stopped it. But that's obviously, maybe to try to circle back around to this, Will, other than, and again, that attack I talk about with Trump on the Internet Research Agency, it's just that these two stories came out within a relatively same period of time that I linked the two of them together. And as far as I could tell, there's nothing to suggest that the two are, related otherwise. But it does seem possible that that's maybe part of what the CIA was carrying out there. Do we have any other, we have a lot of maybe cyber attacks. Who knows? They might just be regular kinetic bombing kind of attacks. But reports of cyber attacks coming out of Iran, the attacks there continue to pile up. And I'll stress that, as I've talked about this on the show, accidents happen, and Iran's a big country, and so it's possible that some of this stuff isn't military involvement from an outside country. What do you think about any of this being involved or going on? What's happening in Iran?
Yeah. So we've had like a lot of very strange incidents coming out of Iran lately. I was reading that Yahoo story about the CIA authorization. It was making me think about all these things that have been trickling out of Iran lately. I think there have been like 6 or 7 or 8 like mysterious incidents since just late June in Iran. And a lot of these look like they could possibly be the result of cyber attacks. All this stuff took place near either important infrastructure or near like important military installations. And so there's some things that are kind of suspicious about this. And so just, to kind of run down some of these, there's kind of a surprising number of them. Like June 26th, there was a huge explosion in the city of Parchin near the capital of Iran, where there's a significant military site. The Iranians claim that this blast was caused by some kind of gas leak on a military base. But there were also some satellite photos that leaked that came out there was people in media saying that it looked like this explosion actually took place at a nearby missile site in Kojir, not actually in Parchin. I'm not totally sure what to make of those conflicting claims, but we definitely did have some kind of explosion at or near Parchin, where there are important military sites. On that same day, you also had a major power outage in the city of Shiraz, where there's also a pretty big air base. And a lot of people are speculating sort of that these were related somehow. On June 30th, just a couple days later, there was a blast at a medical clinic in Tehran, which killed a few people, which the Iranians also say was a gas leak. July 2nd, you had another explosion at a major uranium enrichment facility in Natanz, which is like a key facility in the Iranian nuclear program and their nuclear energy program. And I don't think Iran would actually say if it did affect operations there, this blast. They claim it didn't, but they do say it destroyed some building that I think they referred to it as like a shed or something. But who knows like how much actual impact this had on the facility. I don't think they would say if it did. But Iran has retaliated. This is one of the only cases where Iran has actually openly suggested that some kind of foreign power might be behind it, or at least the only one that I had seen. They they threaten retaliation against any foreign power that may have been behind it. I think is kind of how they worded it. They didn't like directly accuse anyone, but they did kind of suggest like, hey, if we find that someone did this, we're going to retaliate. And we should recall too that back in 2010. The U.S. and probably the Israelis knocked out a bunch of centrifuges at the same exact facility with a cyber attack, with the Stuxnet virus. So this would not be unprecedented at all, the attacks on this specific facility. So that was one of the bigger ones. But just one day later, you had this huge fire in Shiraz, the same town hit by that power outage, like a mysterious fire. I don't think anyone really had a good explanation for how it started. And then just a day after that, there was another fire at a power plant in the city of Avaz. And the very next day, there was this big chlorine leak at this sophisticated petrochemical plant in the same city of Avaz, which sent a bunch of people to the hospital. So I might be leaving some of these out. I think there was like a huge fire too at a port this week in Iran. But there's just been a lot of very weird little incidents like this of like explosions or random fires or big flashes of light at or around infrastructure or military installations. And after pretty much all of these stories, if you go online, you can see people speculating and suggesting that these were caused by, cyber attacks or sabotage or just straight up airstrikes or just like a direct, bombing or something. Like, for example, the New York Times cited an unnamed Middle East intelligence official, which is usually code for Israel when they say that. But they said that the Natanz explosion was caused by a bomb. And then you had an Iranian general also, Gholam Reza Jalali, who came out and said that it may have been a cyber attack at Natanz. So there have been tons and tons of rumors floating around like this that, with usually the U.S. and Israel pinned as the culprits in these things. And like you said, like many of these things could be unrelated, to each other. And there's not really any like really definitive evidence here that any of these are cyber attacks. But just the sheer number of incidents and with the links to the military sites and stuff, I do think it's quite suspicious and worth discussing like what's going on here. Accidents do happen. Things catch on fire. That certainly happens. Iran's a big country, like you said. And on any given day, I'm sure you could find some incidents, but typically not explosions and stuff. Maybe fires or maybe, issues at power plants. But we've seen several explosions, some of them at missile sites and nuclear facilities. I just think this stuff is worth considering, especially when we're seeing things like this Yahoo report was suggesting that the CIA has been given the green light to launch, attacks like this to damage infrastructure basically whenever it wants to. And so I don't think it's like kookery or unjustified conspiracy theorizing to consider that maybe there's more behind some of these stories, that, maybe there's some covert action from intelligence agencies like the CIA or the Mossad.
Certainly. And, you can't even help but think that if this was any kind of leak, official leak, that maybe that's a part of what they're trying to imply. The maximum pressure campaign. Iran isn't working. It's been a complete failure for the Trump administration. And so provoking Iran into, doing something, more outwardly and obviously that they could label as aggressive could be, something that really helps the Trump administration to generate some momentum against Iran with the upcoming arms embargo, the UN arms embargo against Iran preparing to be lifted in October. Maybe they're looking for Iran to carry out another attack, so Russia and China not to veto extending the arms embargo. Something like that comes to mind. The other thing I thought when I'm reading all these stories, especially since so many of them are reports to be like gas leaks and explosions of that kind, it is just, the U.S. maximum pressure campaign has been going on for, many years, 2 full years now under Trump, right? And, before that, there was pretty much a maximum pressure campaign under Obama. And to what extent is the Iranian infrastructure crumbled to the point at this point? And could this be just a result of them unable to import, new products and stuff like that, replacement parts? And so as, they're increasingly poor because they can't sell their oil and their products, they can't import what they need to, we've seen this in Venezuela, a lot of their generators won't work because, Siemens, originally made them, and this is a German company, and so they comply with U.S. sanctions, import the spare parts they need to fix their generators. Is that kind I think at least in some cases it seems like something like that may be going on. And overall, I guess it's important to understand with the history of Stuxnet, this announcement by the U.S. and the CIA, that it definitely justifies the Iranian paranoia, and it gives it quite a bit of grounding in reality. And so even if it turns out that several of these events are just legitimate accidents, have nothing to do with the U.S. or Israel or Mossad or the MEK or whoever else is suspected of being behind it, but it's just really, some guy installed the part wrong, and then the regulator didn't work, and one day the thing didn't close all the way, and then there was a leak and an explosion. These things happen, right? And it's not impossible that that's the case. But history here, especially over the past couple of years in the current situation, I think people should understand the Iranian paranoia and, factor it into how the U.S. is approaching and treating Iran in the near future.
Right. And regarding the sanctions and stuff and how that might actually be indirectly causing things like this. I agree. I think that's a perfectly plausible possibility there, that, their infrastructure is kind of just getting run down. The state is deprived of its revenues because of the oil sales. And there's also the whole coronavirus thing, too. Who knows what effect that's having on supply chains and personnel at some of these facilities. Maybe they're shorthanded. They can't quite, keep an eye on the leaking, leaks or things like that. I don't know. I think there are other possibilities here other than a direct CIA cyber attack. But yeah, we should also consider the sort of indirect impact of sanctions and how they, can't get new parts and stuff like that. And just real quick, swinging back to sort of the purpose of that Yahoo exclusive. There were a couple officials in there who were kind of skeptical or critical of the Trump administration, but you do kind of get the idea that some of them are bragging a little bit. They're kind of I don't know, yeah, we took off the gloves of the CIA.
Well, especially at the part of the article I was just gonna jump in, especially the part of the article where they're talking about, well, George Bush didn't let us do this, Obama didn't let us do this. We didn't even think Trump was gonna let us do it, but he signed it. That sounded like a little bit of a victory lap to me.
Right, like a pitch or something, yeah.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks for coming back on the show. Tell people where to find your work, and then, yeah, I think we'll wrap up there.
Yeah, I think we hit all the stuff we plan to talk about. If people want to find what I'm writing, probably the best and easiest way is just to go to my Twitter handle where I share everything I write there, at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. You can find me at on Facebook. I'm just Will Porter. Otherwise, the Daily Sheeple, Consortium News, the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com. I have archives at all those sites.
All right. Thanks for coming back on the show, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.